It's a great honour to have been made a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. This means a great deal to me because of the role the Institute has had in shaping the debate in this country about international affairs over so many years, but also because of the role the Institute played in shaping my own career. As a 16-year-old high school student in Melbourne, I was lucky enough to have a history teacher, Lucy Mayo, who was a member of the Institute, and recognising my growing but entirely undeveloped interest in Australia and the world, she would regularly let me know about speakers at the AIIA's Melbourne office, which is not, for those of you who know it, the current elegant building, but a rather dusty first floor office in Swanston Street. And she'd send me off with a note to Nance Dickens, the long-time secretary of the Institute, asking if I could be allowed to sit in. That was really the first time I was aware of the existence of a community of Australians who shared my growing sense that everything that we wanted to do as a country depended to a large extent on our engagement with the wider world. And that experience was an important part of my own decision to study international relations at Melbourne University and to go on to a career dealing with Australian foreign policy and analysis from, as you heard from me, in a number of different angles, both inside government service and out of it. So that's been the distinguished role of the AIIA over 80 years now, to help educate and inform Australians about our position in the region and the world. And it's also been the issue that has most interested me throughout my professional life, how Australia engages with the world. You can think about that issue in lots of different ways. You can think about it historically, in structural or normative ways. You can focus on broad strategy and statecraft, on specific aspects of bilateral relations, or any of the dimensions of international security. But today I want to talk about an aspect of international relations that I think receives too little consideration. It's time, in my view, to pay attention to what makes it work, to its processes, to diplomacy. So my objective today is to try to clarify what diplomacy means and to convince you that its role in the management of international relations is growing. If I'm right, and successful diplomacy is increasingly important to national success, then obviously it matters how well it's done. So I want to end by looking specifically at Australian diplomacy, at how we do it as a country. My present job has almost nothing to do with diplomacy, so you can take with more than the normal degree of confidence the expression that these remarks represent my personal views only and not those of my agency or the government. Few other terms in international relations are as fuzzy as diplomacy. It's used in such a vast number of ways, ranging from a description of all the work done by employees of foreign ministries to the act of negotiation, from the processes and machinery of international relations to a synonym for excessive politeness. I was reminded of this by an article that Peter Harcher had in the Sydney Morning Herald a few months ago, quoting a professor of psychology, no less, to the effect that the former Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd was timid. Now, that may seem unlikely to you, but don't get diverted. My point is that the professor went on to justify his claim by saying, and remember, Rudd had a formal training in timidity. It's called diplomacy. I'm hardly the first to comment on this confusion. In his classic 1939 book, Diplomacy, Sir Harold Nicolson notes that, quote, If, for instance, the word army were used to mean the exercise of power, the art of strategy, the science of tactics, the profession of a soldier, and the combative instincts of man, we should expect public discussion on military matters to lead to much misunderstanding. So it's important to clear away the undergrowth to explain what I'm not talking about. First, diplomacy is not the strategy that sets out the objectives of the state in the international arena, whether that's formally articulated as grand strategy or more often is the gradual accumulation of broad, sometimes unstated, long-term goals. Secondly, it's not the specific foreign policies that are developed by governments to reach those strategic ends. So when, to take a recent example, our Foreign Minister says that it's incumbent on Australia to support Burma in practical ways and to encourage reforms that take root and sustain the conditions for further change to improve the lives of the Burmese people, that's not diplomacy, that's foreign policy. And diplomacy is not the resources, either human or financial, that support those policies. Now, because this is a public speech and tomorrow is budget day, I should make it clear that my remarks today shouldn't be construed as an argument for more resources for DFAT. Indeed, given current circumstances and my own position, I'd rather make an argument for more resources for ONA. As the chair of the Lowy Institute's Blue Ribbon panel on the instruments of Australian foreign policy a couple of years ago, my views on that are already a matter of public record. My point today is about the structures of the international system, not about where resources are deployed. And in any case, while DFAT is important to Australian diplomacy, it's not by any means the only place in Australia where diplomacy is done. As the process of statecraft, diplomacy is undertaken by many more actors than simply the professional employees of foreign ministries. It's performed by heads of government and ministers, by aid officials, by military officers, by intelligence services, and increasingly by special representatives dealing with specific problems identified by government, like Rick Smith, the Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, or Bill Patterson, the Ambassador for Counter-Terrorism. So diplomacy isn't a goal, it's method and process. It's the path that statecraft takes as it picks its way to its objectives across the treacherous contingent swamp of the international environment. To put it another way, diplomacy is a form of politics. If, as Clausewitz says, war is the continuation of politics by other means, then diplomacy is the form of politics that is marginalised when conflict begins. You can find a fascinating, a crude but fascinating measure of this in Google Books Ngram view. That's, I don't know if any of you have come across, but it's a tool which allows you to measure the use of specific words in the millions of books that have been digitised by Google. And plotting the use of the word diplomacy in books written in English between 1800 and 2000, you find a very distinct drop in periods of conflict and a sharp rise, especially after the First and Second World Wars, when it's time to pick up the pieces. Like all politics, successful diplomacy incorporates an understanding of the views of others, the art of persuasion, a talent for negotiation, an appreciation of the effectiveness of pressure, and a capacity to shape the environment and build coalitions. Now, of course, states aren't the only occupants of the international space. There are an increasing number of non-state actors, businesses, advocacy groups, an estimated 54,000 internationally focused NGOs, and so on, and they're all engaged in lobbying and influencing the global system. But what they do is not diplomacy in the sense in which I'm using it. The diplomacy I'm talking about is the work nation states do to advance their purposes in the world. Over the past 10 years, which is a period I've written before, I think we'll see in retrospect as the national security decayed, the idea of diplomacy has been oddly absent from the commentary and analyses, the books and the journal articles, the op-eds and so on, the political narratives, if you like, which have attempted to make sense of our world. There's been plenty of discussion about policy objectives that diplomacy serves and the forums in which diplomacy is conducted, but much less about its effectiveness and changing functions. The reasons diplomacy has faded from prominence are several, but they go to the nature of the world that governments have been grappling with. After the trauma of 9/11 in much of the Western world, we characterised ourselves as engaged in a war against terror. And as I noted earlier, war displaces diplomacy. Our adversaries were not the usual targets of diplomacy. We didn't see how we could deter them, and we weren't willing or able to negotiate with them. On many different fronts, we were adjusting ourselves to the emergence of a globalised world made possible by the technologies of the information revolution, in which policy responses were required not just to the actions of other states, but to increasingly powerful groups operating across and outside global borders, to terrorists and hackers and pirates and people smugglers. The international environment of the early 21st century was also one in which neoconservative and neoliberal modes of thought were dominant. Policymakers spoke about the world in ways that emphasised values rather than interests. Values are absolute and interests are relative. Both are important drivers of foreign policy, but the role of diplomacy is obviously greater in a world in which interests can be weighed rather than one in which values are judged. I don't mean that diplomacy disappeared during this period. As world politics, it's been going on all the time. The counter-terrorism agenda, the putting together of coalitions of the willing and so on, all required active diplomacy. But its role and character altered, and in my line of business, its analytical relevance to the way we think about the world diminished. But I believe all this is about to change. We're now entering a period in which diplomacy will matter again more than it has since the middle of the 20th century and the beginning of the Cold War. And without slighting in any way the work of past generations of diplomats, it's going to be a more complex and challenging form of diplomacy with more than the usual scope for success and failure. Let me say why I think that's true. First, the number of significant state actors in the international system is increasing. The economic weight of China and the other large developing countries, the so-called BRICS, continues to influence the global system, to shift rather the global balance. Their future trajectories may be uncertain, but it's almost impossible to imagine a reversion to a power structure like that we saw in the 20th century. As the global financial crisis showed, these new powers need to be at the negotiating table on the large issues facing the international community. These range from, of course, climate change to counter-proliferation, and are of such complexity that they can only be addressed collectively and through negotiation, which is to say, diplomatically. The second point is that each of these powers will need to be engaged individually. The BRICS are not going to form a wall. In the mid-20th century, the two powerful alliance systems made the management of global politics relatively orderly. It was certainly dangerous, but the negotiating blocks were clear. The emergence of a more multipolar world with coalitions of interest developing over individual issues multiplies the dimensions of diplomacy and the importance of its role. Thirdly, I think the most important global relationship in coming decades, that between the United States and China is multidimensional. As Hillary Clinton said last week in Beijing, the relationship between the two countries is thoroughly and inescapably interdependent. The relationship between Washington and Moscow mattered hugely during the Cold War to prevent mutual annihilation, among other things. But the Washington-Beijing relationship now matters for everything, from global security to the prosperity of the international economy, from climate change to energy supplies. We saw last week the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which covers an agenda vastly different from anything we saw between the superpowers in 20th century diplomacy. The final reason diplomacy will matter more is that its objects, that is the entities it's trying to influence, are increasing in number as the deeper effects of the information revolution, especially new forms of social media, spread through societies. So just as the circumscribed court politics of the 18th century gave way to the more complex diplomacy of the nation-state in the 19th century, and new dimensions of multilateral diplomacy were added in the 20th century, in the 21st century, an additional dimension of public diplomacy is needed to address the publics which increasingly shape state behaviour. As Joseph Nye says, in the information age, it's not just whose army wins, but whose story wins. And diplomats are, above all, storytellers, the first of them in the Greek city. First of them in the Greek city-states were, of course, actors, and mostly they've never looked back. The winners in this new environment will be those states which understand the nature of world politics and can manage it effectively. So how will Australia fare in this? It seems to me, and to most of the practitioners I know, that some countries generate more outcomes from their diplomacy than others. It's necessary, of course, that the policies being pursued are themselves creative and cohesive and realistic, but the way it's done also matters. I said earlier that diplomacy is a means to an end, but it's also a skill, and as with any skill, technique matters. Knowledge of your subject, tradecraft, including the ability to communicate with counterparts in your own language, training and practice all determine effectiveness. But diplomacy is also culturally shaped. Nations have their own characteristic styles of diplomacy, just as they have styles of playing rugby. History, geography and mores shape our interaction with the outside world just as comprehensively as they shape domestic politics. In 2001, Michael Wesley and I conducted a survey of the views of DFAT officers. Nearly 70% of respondents believed that there was a distinctly Australian style of diplomacy. They characterised it most frequently as energetic, informal and direct. I've written myself that the fear of abandonment is the primal Australian fear, dating back maybe to the Second Fleet, and that its policy consequence has been an imperative in our foreign policy to want to remind others of our presence. That's shaped our alliance strategies, our military engagements and our multilateral commitments. It's also affected our diplomacy in a very direct way, generating a tempo that Alexander Downer described to Michael Wesley and me as irrepressibly activist. We want to make sure we're noticed, and the tone is distinct too. If you feel far away, you tend to speak more loudly to make your voice heard. But that same effect of distance has had another less often noted impact on our diplomacy. Space gives you confidence. Continents are harder to coerce. Surrounded by a moat of water, we're freer of the anxieties and pressures that inevitably weigh upon the diplomacy of most countries, bordered by neighbours and burdened by that history. That means, I think, that we're more willing to take risks. This diplomatic confidence certainly reflects the national mood. When asked the question about the state of the world, how safe do you feel, a whopping 93% of people surveyed in the Lowy Institute's annual poll in 2010 said they felt safe or very safe, which is a result consistent with all earlier Lowy polling. I want to end by looking briefly at three successful examples of Australian diplomacy, each separated by roughly a decade, to identify some common threads. I emphasise again that my principal interest here is in the process, that is the way it was done, rather than the policy itself. In 1989-90, following opportunities opened up by the end of the Cold War, Australia seized an opportunity to help broker an international settlement between Cambodia's divided factions, which eventually led to elections under UN supervision. Australia wasn't the only actor, but the settlement wouldn't have taken place without Australian diplomacy. Driven by the Minister, Gareth Evans, the process involved high-level engagement, tireless shuttle diplomacy, a lot of detailed preparatory work, the effective use of multilateral organisations, including the UN Security Council, and close collaboration with Indonesia. Australia ended up as a large contributor to and providing the leadership for the UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia. A decade later, 10 years later, 1999, the turmoil in East Timor, following elections which had been partly prompted by Australian actions, led the Australian government to the urgent task of lobbying for and putting together, within just 3 weeks of the ballot on 30 September, the first elements of the International Force East Timor, INTERFET, an Australian-led UN-endorsed peacekeeping force. To bring this together, the Howard government used a range of diplomatic levers. Multilaterally, it needed to secure the endorsement of the UN Security Council, and Howard used very effectively a fortuitously timed leaders' meeting of APEC, another Australian diplomatic accomplishment, to lobby and persuade. Regionally, success required Australian missions and defence and ADF officials to persuade a number of Asian countries, including some of Indonesia's own ASEAN partners, to participate. Above all, Indonesia itself had to accept the intervention, and also critical was persuading the United States to use its weight to support INTERFET, including in some vital practical ways. Then 10 years later, in 2009, came the culmination of Australian efforts to ensure that in the wake of the global financial crisis, the G20, of which Australia was a member, would become the successor organisation to the G7 as the main coordinating forum for discussion of the global economy. Described by Kevin Rudd as lying at the absolute core of Australian foreign policy, he first made a proposal which drew on earlier work by others, including the Canadian Prime Minister, in a speech to the UN General Assembly on 25 September 2008. In the 12 months between the day of that, exactly 12 months between the day of that speech and the Pittsburgh summit, which cemented the G20's role, Australia worked insistently first to help convince President Bush to use the existing G20 organisation as the first point of response to the global crisis, and then to have others, including the Europeans, drop counter-proposals for a smaller organisation that would have excluded Australia. As Rudd said later, it was a hard-won prize. Many others around the world actively fought against it. We prevailed through more effective global diplomacy. The earlier work Australia had put into the G20 at the level of finance ministers, especially under Peter Costello's chairmanship in 2006, also helped. That diplomacy again required careful preparation, high-level engagement, including a legendary torrent of phone calls from the Prime Minister, and intense international advocacy, including from the ambassador in Washington, who at that stage was Dennis Richardson, and the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, Mike Callaghan, the Deputy Secretary of Treasury. The lessons I draw from all these examples are that Australian diplomacy is most successful when it's backed by careful and detailed support work, open to ideas from outside government. In each of the examples I gave, the work of academics and think tanks had important contributions to make. When it's driven by the active engagement of ministers, when it uses our alliance relationship constructively, utilises effectively our long record of participation in multilateral organisations, builds external coalitions, especially with the region. The Indonesian relationship was important in each of these cases. South Korea was a key to success with the G20. And finally, which draws, as these did, on all the dimensions of state power, political, strategic, political, military and economic. Now, I don't want to sound too boosterish. I could just as easily cite some unsuccessful examples of Australian diplomacy, but that would have caused me far more problems in a public address. And the flip side of the confidence that informs our diplomacy can be smugness, incaution, intolerance of others who are not in our comfortable position. It makes us impatient for outcomes. We, and I'm not just talking about the policy community, but about commentators and the public, can lose sight of how long it takes to bring about change in the international system. Kevin Rudd's Asia Pacific community was a victim of such immediate expectations. Looking ahead, as the locus of global power moves closer to Australia, our relevance to the interests of the main players is greater, economically, politically and strategically. We were marginal to the diplomacy of the Cold War. We're far more central to the diplomacy of the emerging world. But that doesn't mean we'll automatically get a seat at the table, or that what we want will fall into our resource-rich lap. The big players, both the established ones and the emerging ones, will still tend sometimes to deal more with each other than the rest of the world, no matter what the region or the crisis. There'll be more of a global spotlight on what Australia can deliver diplomatically in the region and beyond, and in other ways too, but we'll pay a bigger reputational cost if we get it wrong. Thanks very much, Ian.